People that went down and dug out got the bends, and some of them had lifelong illnesses because of it. It was expensive, but it was built to last, and to this day, it still stands and is being used. It took about 50 years to get to the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge only took 2 years to build, and I'm sure it was intended to last. In the time between the Brooklyn Bridge and the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, the engineers certainly would have figured out that no one was going to pay the expense to keep building bridges like the Brooklyn Bridge. So they would have found new materials and new techniques. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge was sleek, and even as they were building it, it was moving a bit. When they finally finished it, a wind blew up. And if you Google Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapse, you'll see what happened. The materials of steel and concrete that we think of as very rigid began to rotate each end of the bridge a different direction. And it just kept twisting further and further like a ribbon until it blew apart and fell into the water. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge was not built to last. Bridges are built to connect one place to another, but really they're built to connect people to one another. We don't build bridges between places where we're not planning on going. And so we use it as a metaphor as well to talk about human relationships. We say in communities where there's tensions that we need to build bridges between parts of the community. And as you all have, in times in your life, left jobs or organizations, you're told on the way not to do what? Burn your bridges. Don't burn those relationships, because you never know when you might need those human connections again. So if you think about human relationships as bridges, how do we build those that last, and how do we build them in ways that don't last? Well, Paul gives us a clue. He starts off by saying, if you speak but without love, you're a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If you act, and he talks about even faithfulness. If you give of your body, if you're really generous, but you do those things without love, then it means nothing, and you gain nothing. And then he gets to the really familiar part. Love is patient, love is kind, it's not envious, it's not rude, it's not boastful, it does not insist on its own way, love is not irritable, it bears all things, believes all things, right? So Paul starts to say what it is that love looks like, and then he comes around at the end and talks about being grown-ups in faith, and says, faith, hope, and love abide, which means they last, and the greatest of these is love. Faith, hope, and love. These are gifts we get from God. Not our own faith, our own hope, and our own love, because those don't get us very far. But the faith, hope, and love, these gifts of God, they last, particularly the love. Paul seems to be telling us that if we're going to build human relationships and have connection and build those bridges, this ought to be the way that we do it, with faith, hope, and love as the pillars that hold it up. I was in class a couple of weeks ago with my buddy Rob, and Rob, since he started seminary before I did, has been asking one question, which is there any scenario where grace does not apply? It's a great question, but I ask a similar question today. Is there any human relationship that we would build, bridge that we would connect people with, where we wouldn't want the pillars to be faith, hope, and love? Can you build healthy human community without starting with God's gifts that last, gifts of faith, hope, and love? And to answer that question, we can maybe first turn to one of the places where we often hear this passage, which is what? Weddings. Can you imagine a wedding? And so you say, can you build a marriage without faith, hope, and love as the pillars? Imagine a wedding where I stood up here and said, do you promise to be impatient with one another? Do you promise to be unkind? Do you promise to be irritable and resentful? Do you promise to always insist that your way is the way and that your ideas are the right ideas? How would that go? Right? We know that this is not how you build a marriage that lasts, that faith, hope, and love are better pillars that can carry it. So Paul, as he gives us this instruction, it seems to make sense for a marriage. Now, a marriage as a bridge is not a long bridge to build. You already hopefully love this person and want to spend time with them. And if you think about out in the world where there are bridges, there are short bridges that just go over a roadway here or a creek there out in the country. Short bridges still ought to be built well, but they're not nearly as complicated as long bridges. It's easy enough to maybe, or hard enough, to build a bridge between spouses or within a family on faith, hope, and love. But once we get outside of the walls of our house and out into the community, we encounter people whose worldviews are different, people who disagree with us on major issues, people that we don't want to love or not even like and get along with. So the question then becomes, can we build community? Can we build connections, those long distances with people that are so different from us in the ways that we see the world? We might ask it a different way. Because sometimes we maybe think we don't have to build those bridges. If I don't love someone, don't like them, don't want to spend time with them, maybe I don't have to make that connection. So we could say, today, in an election season, do we have to build bridges between Republicans and Democrats? Do we have to build bridges across issues like guns in our culture and the different opinions about that? Do we have to build bridges around immigration, education, healthcare? Do we have to build those bridges at all? And I would suggest to you today that that question lies on a false premise about whether or not the bridge needs to exist, because the bridge already exists. We live in community. And what it means to live in community is that we are all sharing certain things. We share an economy. We shop in the same stores if we live in the same neighborhoods. We shop and eat at the same places. So we share those places of commerce. We share doctors and hospitals and clinics. We share the education system. We share water. We share all of these things that make us a community together, including literal bridges and roads. And all of these things that we share connect us, whether we want to be connected or not. So the question turns from, do we have to build these bridges, to what kind of bridges are we building? Are we building bridges that connect us that are founded on faith, hope, and love? Or are we building bridges that are going to, like the Tacoma Narrows, stress, strain, twist, and break apart? It's an important question for us to wrestle with, because as we think about the life of the church, almost all of us would say we like to keep politics and church separate, correct? We don't want to talk about politics in the church. We don't want to talk about politics at work. Let's keep those things as far apart as possible. But I want you today to think about politics not as the debates and not as the partisan stuff, which we ought not have necessarily here, but to think of politics as the way that we negotiate the way we live together. Because how do we get roads and bridges? Well, we get them from collective governing of one another. How do we get healthcare and all the rest of it? We share all these things, and politics is simply the way that we negotiate how we're going to live in that together. We don't always do it well, but it is the bridge building that we have to do to live in community. And if we think about politics that way, I think it ought to raise a different question for us about how we live in connection with that with faith. Because the most difficult bridges, the longest ones for us to bridge, are the ones around the issues that are most contentious. So when we talk about guns or healthcare or immigration, all of those issues get us saying, nope, we don't want to talk about that, keep that out of the church, do all the rest of that. But each and every one of those issues is a life and death issue. That's why it's so contentious. Guns are absolutely life and death. Immigration is life and death for someone. When we talk about the economy, when we talk about education, when we talk about healthcare, these are all questions of life and death. And how we negotiate them together, how we connect ourselves together, is also then about life and death. When we say that politics has no place in the life of the church, to say that the way we live together and negotiate that has no life in the church, what we are then saying is that the life of the church has nothing to say about issues of life and death. We're saying that the gospel has nothing to say about life and death. If the gospel has anything to say, it is about life and death. It is about Jesus who came into this world to live with us and then die for us. When he went to the cross, Jesus built a bridge from us to God. Because the way of sin is a way that disconnects us from God. It's the way of death. And Jesus on that cross built a bridge to connect us with God's grace. And it doesn't matter how far we want to push ourselves away from that grace, that bridge gets to wherever we will go. Because God will keep bringing us that forgiveness and that love and that grace. So as we gather as people of faith, we need to understand that we live in community. We live in all of these spaces of civic culture, of church culture, of family culture. And in that way, we live with these connections. I think we feel what is going on with the bridges that connect us. We know they are stressed and straining. We can feel the impatience. We can feel the arrogance and the rudeness. We can feel the irritability because our collective discourse has started to live in those places. The bridges that connect us, if we just think about our political discourse, does it sound like a lot of noisy, clanging, and cymbals? If you speak without love, that's what it sounds like. If you act without love, it means nothing and it gains you nothing. And if you look at our collective life, to the extent that we have separated our faith from the way we choose to navigate how we live together, we take love out of that, and we're standing on this bridge that's stressed and straining. So what are we called to do? I would suggest to you that we are called to take out into the world faith, hope, and love. these gifts of God that last, that we are called to be bridge builders, even as the bridge is twisting and straining. Now, that does not mean we're trying to create a Christian theocracy with which we rule the world, but rather we start from the bottom and share these gifts of faith and hope and love that we've been given. And it's not just taking them with us, but it's looking for them. Finding faith, hope, and love in the world and celebrating it, lifting it up. And we do it in all sorts of ways. If you volunteer someplace in this community, hopefully you carry with you God's gifts that last. Faith, hope, and love. You carry with you the patience and the kindness and not the irritability and those other things. If you go out into this community and shop, which we all do, if you eat somewhere, hopefully we carry with us God's faith, hope, and love, these gifts that last. But not just carry them with us, look for them. And when we see them, celebrate them and lift them up and point to them so people can see where God is at work in our community. And this counts everywhere. When we get into these big issues, we ought to head into the debates that we have about how we live together with faith, hope, and love as our foundation. And look into those contentious areas, whatever they are about, and try to find where God's faith, hope, and love might be at work, and to lift that up and point to it. And yes, even in the ballot box, I would suggest that we ought to go there with faith, hope, and love, looking for that where God is at work in these processes so that we can continue to lift that up as God's bridge builders. Jesus has built this bridge of grace to us. Jesus has gifted us with these gifts that last, faith, hope, and love. We are called out to be bridge builders in the world. Is that work going to be easy? Not even close. We're going to have to dive down into the deep waters of the river and get sick digging out that stuff so that we can plant those pillars of faith, hope, and love into the bedrock of the communities and the connections that we seek to make. And it probably would seem overwhelming to think that just us gathered here could do that. But how many did Jesus start with? 12. And a few more beyond that gathered. And they went out and carried faith, hope, and love. And with it, absolutely changed the course of the world. With us this day, may we be bold to believe that God can work through us in that same way. To send us out with the gifts that last, faith, hope, love, to transform this world with love as we go. Amen.